Great. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hudi. Thank you very much, Elias. And that was a brilliant talk, Hudi. I'm also approaching English as the lingua franca in archaeology, but from a completely different perspective. And this paper comes from the session we co-organised, me, Hudi, and Brody at TAG this year about challenging English as the lingua franca and the place for other languages in archaeology. But this also comes from inside it, because obviously the dialect is Geordie dialect, a part of English. So yeah. So Gannin Hyem, Geordie dialect, the virtual, and Neolithic South Shield. So yeah, like we mentioned, English is the lingua franca for archaeology and loads of other disciplines, and specifically it's standard British English or SBE that is considered the correct way of speaking English and has been for centuries. And it's this variety of the language that is predominantly taught to non-Anglophone speakers when they learn it for the first time. Yeah, obviously within English as a language, there's like a multiplicity of different dialects and accents that never get used in proper archaeological narratives. And in this paper, I want to use my own dialect, Geordie, to explore what a speculative narrative of a Neolithic site in South Shields, which is my hometown, and you can see here, would sound like. And to write this speculative narrative, I've taken influence from a number of writers, those who've written in Geordie and Northumbrian dialects, but also Harry, Josephine, Giles, who wrote a sci-fi novel in Orcadian dialect and highlighted the creative potential of minor languages and regional dialects in destabilising a majoritarian language like English. And I also used Deleuze's concept of the virtual to help us construct the narrative and think a bit about what a virtual past I could possibly actualise from the site I'm going to be talking about. And to sort of end this little introduction bit, there's a really good quote from Brent Atkins in his guide to Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus, where he says, "Everyday usage, borrowings from other languages, literature and slang continually disturb the stability of a major language." And like in the tag session and what Hudi was talking about, approaching it from archaeology from a different, like sort of outside of it, from like a different language, I want to try and destabilise English with this from the inside using my dialect. So before we get into the speculative narrative and all sort of archaeology, we need to sort of cover dialects and what is a dialect. And I want to offer a disclaimer here. I'm not a linguist at all. I didn't do English language at A level or anything like that. But the definition I got was a language vocabulary distinguished from other varieties by differences of grammar and vocabulary. And as a Deleuzian, I find that a bit sort of, unsatisfactory because, a difference between, and I would kind of prefer to think about the difference a particular assemblage of grammar and vocabulary maybe makes in the world. But again, I'm not a linguist. And as you can see from this, there's a multiplicity of different dialects in the UK. And there's that joke, you go X amount of miles in the UK and you can go through several different accents and dialects in the short space of time. But amongst, like I say, amongst the variety of ways of speaking English, it's SBE which is considered to be the most important, like the most correct way of doing it, and that itself is a dialect. And you see this sort of, it's used in academic publications, taught at schools and universities, and classically it's what television and radio presenters did on the BBC with a received pronunciation. And for that reason, these guys, Hughes et al., refer to it as the most prestigious British dialect. But then this creates the problem that there's this hierarchical structure where standard British English is sort of seen the most proper, best way of speaking English and writing in English, and then any other dialect that's based on, is seen as sort of kind of lesser than based on differences in grammar and vocabulary. And in several cases, some of these regional dialects are seen as either stupid or comical in comparison to standard British English. Like sometimes, it seems like the butt of the joke, like you get with like Brummies in Birmingham or Scousers in Liverpool. And one of these dialects is Geordie. So for the uninitiated, Geordie is a dialect and an accent from the Tyneside area of northeast England. And I mean, he has some famous Geordies you'll probably know, if depending on what vintage you're from. Galvita St. Pet, Anton Deck, Sarah Milligan, and Jade Thirlwell from Little Mix. And again, I'm not a linguist, so I'm not going to use fancy words like diphthongs to characterise, the dialect. But from my own experience, it's stuff like, we'll pronounce aun as oon, so down would be doon, town would be toon. And we emphasise what H's, where further down the coast in sort of like Middlesbrough and Yorkshire, they generally tend to drop that at the start of words. But we do drop our T's in the middle of sentences and at the end of them. We pronounce our ERs as a, rather as a, sorry, and we'll have like long vowels as well. So a word like, and I can't say this outside of how I normally say it, but photocopier would be photocopier. Here's some words in Geordie that some of you might know. Others might be a bit unfamiliar, but these are terms that I would use in my sort of daily usage, and family and friends would up there, but we don't speak them as maybe broadly as past generations have, or as I'm going to use them in this speculative narrative, but they're still being used. It's not like dead, it's still alive. And the Geordie and Northumbrian dialect has a long sort of history of being used in various mediums of art since, at least the late 18th century that we know of. And I don't have time to go through this completely, in detail, but it covers things like music, and one of the earliest sort of references we have to that is from like the 18th century with the woodgraver and natural historian Thomas Bewick, who sends a letter to his brother in exile in London in 1791, and he has, a dialect song in that. And then the songhole writers of the mid-19th century, like Geordie Ridley, who wrote The Bladen Races, and Cushy Butterfield, and Joe Wilson, who wrote Keep Your Feet Still, Geordie Hinny, which are sort of Tyneside anthems that are later passed on through families, but also re-recorded by folk artists. And today, at Newcastle games, you can still hear the Bladen Races sang in the stands. And then through to literature in the 20th century, we'll get the likes of Sid Chaplin, who wrote in the dialogue of his 1961 novel, The Day of the Sardine, with a Geordie dialect. And Dorothy, who's a poet from my hometown that I only recently discovered, like back end of last year, who wrote about mundane, everyday, working class things in really phonetic Geordie dialect. And something important I think she says that she brings up at the start of one of her collections is, whenever I write in Geordie dialect, I'm unhappily conscious of being unable to reproduce in writing its most attractive feature, our Geordie lilt. But a big influence on this speculative narrative I'm about to give was Deep Wheel Orcadia, which is a sci-fi novel by Harry Josephine Giles. And in this novel, Giles tells the story of people living their lives on this space station version of Orkney in like the far future. But unlike most sci-fi, the narrative's written in like Orcadian dialect. And as you can see from this excerpt here, Giles writes the Orcadian first and really phonetically, but then they translate it into English below. And even like the English can be quite hard to follow, because some of the words have like different sort of like synonyms. You've kind of got to work through which one works best in the context, and it has the effect of sort of really being disruptive and breaking up the flow of the sort of as you're reading it, really. And if you listen to the author do an extract of that, it sounds completely alien and very different to somebody who's not an Orcadian. So it has, it has the effect of destabilizing and disrupting English as a majoritarian language. But if you can do sci-fi in Orcadian, why not a Neolithic narrative in Geordie, especially when this dialect has a long history of writing in it too? So to attempt that, we'll go to South Shields. So South Shields is a seaside town at the mouth of the River Tyne, about 13 miles east of Newcastle, and it's where I'm from. We're known locally as Sandancers, and we're like a subdivision of Geordie, but Sandancers refers to lovely beaches, as you can see here. Historically, we're big on, we're known for our heavy industry. We're sort of coal mines and shipbuilding, and archaeology wise, it's a massive emphasis on the Romans, because we have a 2nd century AD fort there called Arbea, from when the town was called Caerurfa. But despite the emphasis on the Romans, there's sort of traces of a more distant past underneath the town, especially underneath Arbea itself. And Arbea is located on a place in the town called the Low Top, which sort of overlooks the sea to the northeast and the River Tyne to the northwest. And in the 1980s and 90s, there were a series of excavations at the Roman fort, and they revealed a whole host of activity going back to the Mesolithic, with repeated visits and use of the site over millennia. In the Neolithic specifically, there's supposedly an early Neolithic causewayed enclosure, although people have, really dispute this because we've only found 2 of the ditches. And for the uninitiated, basically, this is a monument which is formed by rings or sort of a ring or rings of interrupted ditches, as we can see here. Although, yeah, they've literally only found 2, and they couldn't really excavate the rest because all of this is pretty much residential now. So if it is there, it'll be under the rest of the houses. But significantly, for the time, it was believed to have been an island as a most recent. But the activity I want to focus on comes from the late 4th millennium BC, which is sort of centuries after the causewayed enclosure is silted up, and hundreds of years later. And during this period, we have copious evidence for flint knapping and pit digging on the lower top. And in particular, there's this feature I've circled over here, which was described as a 2-phase curvilinear feature, which has like 3 post holes in the middle of it, and the excavator saw it as being the evidence for a kind of a shelter of some sort. And it's interesting because the fill in it has loads of different flint, but there's in particular there's these 13 pieces of fawn-coloured nodular flint that have been knapped without making a tool and could all be refitted. And that's interesting because there's no chalk in the northeast, and to sort of get that kind of flint, communities in the area needed connections to places further afield, like East Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, as the paper Hodgson et al. Suggests. And it's the events surrounding the interment of these 13 pieces of nodular flint, which is interpreted as a structured deposition in a really classic post-processual kind of way, that the speculative narrative is based on. Before, again, I get to that, how can I write a speculative narrative about these events? Writing a speculative narrative of the Neolithic isn't anything new. It's something that Mark Edmonds in particular does, amongst others, in his Ancestral Geographies book. And I wanted to write a narrative that wasn't necessarily historical fiction, but I also deal with these big sort of gaps in our knowledge outside of knowing the particular processes that led to, where things ended up where they did. Sort of playing that gap, I used Gilles Deleuze's concept of the virtual to help structure it. So for Deleuze, reality is virtual and actual. The actual refers to the things that are in existence currently, like myself, this water bottle, that table, that window. Whereas the virtual is the potentials that haven't been brought into existence yet, like me throwing this water bottle at that window. And the process of transforming the virtual into the actual is known as differentiation or actualization. Within this ontology, the past is also virtual. And whilst I don't have time to get into Deleuze's second synthesis of time, I'm sure you'll be thrilled to know, this means that the past can also be actualized in different ways. And therefore, I use the past's virtual nature to differentiate and actualize one of these virtual pasts from the archaeological record of the site I've just mentioned. But while the virtual is this site of like a multiplicity of potential, it's not endless, but it's structured by something we'll call a diagram. And in terms of this site, I could do things like have people approach the site by logboat, as that exists in the archaeological record, nearby, so it's a virtual capacity, whereas they can't arrive by plane and they can't bring iron swords with them because the historical relations for those things don't exist at the time. So in telling the narrative, I hope to open lines of flight for how narratives in archaeology can sound, but also for the difference they can make in the world within the English language and beyond the ideal standard of British English. And therefore, to explore what a speculative narrative, what I can do with this site in the Geordie dialect, I present to you all now, Gannin Hyem, a speculative narrative. I'll take a quick swig of water. It was getting on late in the afternoon when the boats came in. You could see them for the top of the lower bobbing about in the water down below. Still a wee out like. There was 3 of them in the boats, ones that were carved out of trees. They'd been off on a journey for a canny few weeks down the coast further south, going to see folk the Nadia. When they got when they got to the shallow water, they had to get out and plodge the rest of the way, dragging their boats a hint. Why, it was the back end, man. See, the water was frozen, and the cloudy sand was clagging to their feet. On the beach, they were able to take their cargo out of their boats, skips of brown and yellow flints, cowhides, and the like. Once Stebbins were out, they could catch their breath. They'd been down to Yorkshire, and when they'd left there, About a week ago, it had been all dreek and mizzly, you know, the kind of wet that soaks your clothes despite not stopping it doing. It's clear skies, the new, and none of that rain. Still hard when you weren't moving about like. No for the hard bit. To get back home, the Gorrigan up a height at the top of the law. I'd have done this plenty of times out of the years that been making this journey, but after days at sea, none of them could be fashed. However, the fires had promised warmth and company called out to them. Soon enough, they'd made it up the bank. All around there was these raised bits of ground where somebody had howked the earth out and hiding the remains of a fire. Years and years ago, there'd been these great big rings of these ditches up here, around the top of the law. They could see the ghosts of where the grass grew back funny, but it was all filled up with yellow clay then, no. Of course, this was before anyone that now was alive had been alive, even the oldest gadgy. They could see for tiny bits of flint dotted about that folk had been coming up here for long before this and all. And they've been told this on many a cold winter's night round the fire. Past the pits, they walked out with some fires and a group of several bodies on the honkers near them. Reet Morras, says one, standing up to greet them. She'd been working a hide with a scraper for this shield they're making. There's a pile of newly carved stubs off to one side, so fresh they could give you a spell. See yourself doing, you be jiggered? The three obliged, dumping their skips of flint onto the ground and sat themselves doing. Clamming and all, Eddie Scran, one of the company asks. Aye, how are there? Help yourself. Can he, Johnny? When they'd been doing sooth, they'd seen all sorts. In this one bit, that there was all these nows where they'd been told the deed was buried, and these geek-walla banks that ran on for miles in one direction. Whilst they were doing there, they'd acquired a few other things too. She thoughtfully eyed up the new flints they were talking about. Oh, is that yelling? No, normally you have to know what you're doing with flint. You cannot just break the core and expect an arrowhead. Flint can be a proper worky ticket. It has ways of acting back, of not fracturing who and where you want it to, you know? You can also try to hit a clump with full force, miss, and knock out your fingers. This time, however, it doesn't matter. The napper took the yellow core and started to get the tune on it. The company ate their scran and watched. After she finished, she brought all the pieces together and started hauling the scraps into the pit, and she'd howked open before the company had arrived. What are you digging that for, like? Pipes up a nebby bairn coming out for a deek. Your napper holds up a piece. Well, kidder, she says. Them lot have just brought this from a long way away. Look at her. You should know how important this is to her. It gives her warmth, it helps her with cow hides, it feeds all sorts. It will give her shelter up here when it's blown a hoolie. And with that, she hides it into the pit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johnny. That was amazing. I'm still processing that. He's already with us. Next up, we'll have a talk from Brummie. Reuse